Yeah. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see my slides. Thank you, Aves, for the kind introduction. My name is Hira Dhamyal, and it is my honor to talk about my research in the class today. Specifically, today we are going to talk about how can we decode emotion and personality from the speech signal. A little bit about myself. As Aves said, I have a PhD from Carnegie Mellon University from the Language Technologies Institute, where I was for the last 6 years. I have worked on various problems while I was there, including speech emotion recognition, speaker identification, spoof audio detection, among other problems. After graduating, I started working at Apple on the speech models in the Siri team, and I've been there for the last 1 year. So the outline of the lecture is going to be like so. We will first talk about what really is a speech signal and how do humans produce speech. And then how do we use this signal as input to neural network models? How do we process it? How does it becomes in a shape that we can input to neural models? And then we will talk about how can we decode emotions from the speech signal, specifically revisit our understanding of how emotions are represented, and then a couple of different models that I have explored, and then how can we decode personality and revisit the labels of personality. Just want to make sure if you guys can hear me.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So imagine a scenario where a speaker is standing behind a wall where you cannot see them, but you can hear them. And just from their voice alone, you can make a number of inferences about them, like their gender, their age, their ethnicity, their personality, their emotion, among other such parameters. You do not have to see them. You can just hear them and make these inferences. And similarly, a computer can potentially make the same inferences, but quicker and better than humans can. And in this talk, we focus on how the psychological trait of emotion and personality can be inferred from voice alone. But before we jump into that, I want to take a small detour into understanding what really is human speech. Speech is a sound wave. It is tiny, rapid changes in the air pressure. And looking at how humans produce speech on the diagram here, you can see how humans produce speech. When we expel air out of our lungs, it vibrates the vocal cords in our throat, which sends pulses through the air. And this is the major source of production of sound. It then goes through the oral and nasal cavities to modify the sort of sound we are producing. But this is the major anatomy and the mechanism of how speech is produced in by humans. Now, microphone can capture these tiny changes in the air pressure. It turns it into a stream of numbers, and it represents it in a waveform. And here on the bottom, you can see a waveform. This is a recording of me saying welcome. On the x-axis is time, and y-axis is the amplitude, which is like the intensity or the loudness of how you are saying or what you're saying. An important concept in recording speech is the sampling rate. It is the number of samples that the microphone captures per second. So in this case, it is like 16,000 times per second it is capturing these numbers. So you will see per second there will be 16,000 numbers. However, a waveform is not the best representation of the signal. It is just a bunch of numbers. And in order to convert these numbers into something more meaningful and useful, we convert it into a frequency time dimension. Instead of the amplitude time dimension, we convert it into a frequency time dimension. And we do this by performing Fourier analysis on the signal. Fourier analysis is a somewhat complicated mechanism that I would not go into the detail here, but you can imagine that it splits, like prism splits light. Fourier analysis similarly splits a signal into its bunch of frequencies. So this is an example of the same waveform, and this is the example of the spectrogram, which is the frequency time dimension of it. So on the y-axis, you see frequencies, and you can see that the highlighted portion are the how much of that frequency is present in the signal. And this is so informative that sometimes people who are so trained at looking at spectrograms can just look at a spectrogram and tell what the person is saying. Just the waveform is maybe not as informative, but the spectrogram can be very informative. So for example, when a person is saying a specific vowel like a or e, the specific frequencies and the way that it shows up in the spectrogram is so unique that sometimes people are so experts that they can look at the spectrogram and tell what the person is saying. That's how informative spectrograms can be. So for decades, I just want to go over like some history of how speech is processed, what inputs, what sort of features we extract from it, and what sort of models do we have been used for it. So for decades of the speech feature engineering extraction recipe has been hand engineered. I don't want to go into the depth of each step here, but I want to put it out in case somebody wants to read on their own. But the essential idea is that we start with the waveform and we go through certain steps to reach the MFCCs at the end here, which MFCCs are basically Mel frequency cepstral coefficient, which is another way of representing the spectrogram. And these are one of the most widely used features in the speech domain. These are feature vectors extracted from short span of audio, like 20 to 40 milliseconds of audio. So given an audio recording of, let's say, 1 millisecond of 1 second, you go through 20 to 40 millisecond of frames, and then you have a small window, you then move forward. From that window, you extract features, you move forward, you extract features, you move forward, you extract features. And each of these features are like vectors. So you can imagine at the end, you have like a matrix of features that you can then use. And you can imagine so spectrogram is calculated similarly. And MFCCs are also a similar representation of the signal frequency time dimension. Once you have the feature in traditional machine learning, you feed that into models like support vector machine or Gaussian mixture models and predict a label. So for example, in emotion, our labels will be, is a person happy, is a person sad, is a person angry, and so on and so forth. This is pretty simple and worked until deep neural models came into the picture. In more recent years, instead of telling the model which feature to use, instead of calculating, okay, we have the waveform, we calculate MFCCs, and then these are what we use into the neural model. We let the neural model discover the features that are more important for the task. And so this was somewhat like a revolutionary idea. And this came from like, if you have read convolutional neural models, which were introduced for the image processing domain. So CNN convolves on an image and in order to discover patterns. And similarly, if we say, okay, we have a waveform or we have a spectrogram, can you treat that as an image and try to convolve over it and discover patterns in the spectrogram? So this was sort of one of our way in recent years. In today's world, however, of training large language models, techniques like self-supervised learning have been used for speech tasks as well. These build on the following idea. You can train a large model on enormous amount of unlabeled speech. So you must have seen text large language models, but here we can do this similarly for speech. We can train large language models on huge amounts of speech or unlabeled speech. And we can do so by using a mass language modeling objective, which hides part of the audio and makes the model predicted. And so you like ChatGPT and like these large language models in speech, we have similar large models like Wave2Vec2 or Hubert or WaveLM or Whisper. So if you want to work in the speech domain or if you're getting familiar with it, these are some of the large language models in the speech domain that you should be familiar with. And I just want to say, like, in this day and age, the SOTA models, the state-of-the-art models for emotion and personality are built on top of these large language speech models. Okay, now this was a small detour. I want to jump back into the main topic of this talk. We want to talk about decoding psychological traits like emotion and personality from speech. So to set up the task, we note that there are two essential entities in this problem, the speaker and the observer. The speaker expresses the psychological trait by encoding the trait into the speech signal, and the observer perceives the trait by decoding them from the speech. And any computational method that we build of decoding the traits needs to have the understanding of how the observer decodes the speech and also how the speaker encodes the trait into the speech. So we can study it from both perspectives, how the speaker is speaking and how the observer is listening, in order to have a more heuristic understanding of encoding and decoding of emotion and personality. And in this talk, we will develop computational models that attempt to emulate the human decoding process for two types of psychological traits. Um, so stating this in another way, let X be the speech signal and H be the speaker's psychological trait, which are latent traits, for example, emotion. H is encoded in some features in X, and then we use X to infer H prime. And our goal here is that H and H prime should be similar. So let's focus on decoding emotions. We can talk about both of these aspects, and I have several works under each, but I want to focus here particularly on what is the representation of H prime that closely captures H. Um, and this is like, so we have emotions in our head that we try to express through our speech, and we have some representation of H, like discrete emotions that I will go into it later, like, oh, the person is angry, the person is sad. But is that really what is happening in our head when we are trying to express emotion? So is H prime, what sort of representations are closely capture H? So that is a work that I will go into today. Okay, so before we go into that, there are a handful of what really are emotions. There are a handful of ways of representing emotions, but here I will talk about discrete representation. Discrete representation of emotion are based on Robert Plutchik's explanation in psychology of what are emotions and how are they represented, and so he came up with this Plutchik wheel of emotion, which was introduced in the 1980s. And he postulates that this covers the entire range of human emotion. And he says that human emotions are basically composed of 8 primary emotion that you see at the center here. And everything else are like the modification or extension of the basic emotions. So that is what he says. And so in when we exported this task from psychology into computer science, we said, okay, we have this model of representing emotions, and we have these discrete ways. How can we adopt this? So we set up collecting speech samples in university labs, and we said, okay, we have this person. This person should express anger. This person should express happy. And that's what we that's how we collected speech samples, and then we put a discrete label for each of those samples. So that's what the emotion data sets look like. There are a bunch of speech samples about a couple of seconds long, and then we have these discrete emotion labels for them. But is that really the best way of presenting emotion? As humans, when we state our emotions, we make use of natural language to describe them. We say that if you have to describe someone being angry, we make use of words like loudly to describe them. We will say the man was angrily shouting loudly. And we have like a bunch of different ways of describing anger or happy. We do not just say, oh, this person is angry, this person is angry, this person is angry. So we have a bunch of different ways of describing anger. And the idea in my work here is that can we add natural language descriptions into emotion labels in order to perform better emotion decoding? Can we enable our neural models to learn from these natural language descriptors? So our aim here is to create prompts that include automatically extracted acoustic features of emotional speech, enabling automatic large-scale prompt construction. So that is the goal that we set off with. And our methodology then is this. Given an audio recording, what we do is we extract these acoustic properties. So pitch is a property that we can extract from the signal, which tells us, so generally like females have higher pitch than males do. And all of these properties are something that prior work has already established that these are correlated to emotion. So for example, low pitch is generally associated with negative emotions like fear, and high pitch is associated with positive emotions like happiness or surprise. And similarly, intensity, you can imagine intensity is like the loudness of your speech. And you can imagine that when you're very excited or happy, or angry when you speak with high intensity, and when you're sad or melancholy, you speak with low intensity. And so these are some of the correlations that were already established in prior literature that we then said, okay, we can use these. We can automate the pipeline by extracting these signals by extracting these features from the speech signal, and maybe somehow add that into the prompt. So what we do is that we extract these acoustic features, and we set some once we have those numbers, we set some cutoffs based on the average numbers reported in literature. For pitch, since this is a very gender-dependent feature, we bin it into 4 different bins based on where the number lies on average. So if it is less than 132.5 hertz, we say, okay, it is a low male pitch bin, because males generally have lower pitch, so that's where this audio will lie. For intensity, we have a cutoff at 60 dB. If it is less than 60 dB, we say it is low intensity. If it's higher, we say high intensity. So this is a very crude way of binning a given audio. That's the first step that we had. So how do we use these prompts? So let's say in a data set, we have an audio that is labeled with the label anger. If we use the prompt, we call this the class label, which is anger. If we extract pitch from the audio recording and we then bin it, let's say it was put into the bin of low male pitch anger, and this is called the pitch prompt. And then let's say the prompt using intensity label is high intensity anger. And so you can see that the label occurs at the end of all of these prompts, and then based on what the signal looked like, and based on what the acoustic property of the signal was, we binned it into different bins. And so these are the example of the acoustic prompts. So what we do is that we take these prompts, we pair it with the audio. So this audio will be paired with anger, will be paired with low male pitch anger, will be paired with high intensity anger. So it will be paired with all of these prompts and then input into a model. And if we say, okay, we do not have to use just one of these prompts, we can use all of these prompts, and that's what we call prompt augmentation here. Okay. These are all of the emotion data sets, prevalent emotion data sets that we have in the domain. It's not a lot compared to what other problems have, like speaker identification has huge numbers, huge hours of data. But these are some of the biggest data sets that we have. And I'm showing here the number of different emotion classes that are presented in the data set. So for example, the CMU MOSAI data set has 9 different discrete emotions represented. And it is not always the case that we have the same emotion presented in another data set. So there is a discrepancy in how they're labeled and in how many labels are present. For this task, the model that we use is the CLAP model, which stands for Contrastive Language Audio Pre-training Model. This comes from the audio classification or audio captioning task. We adapt this model for the emotion recognition task. What this model takes in is audio text pairs. So we have the audio here, and we have the associated text at the top here. So each audio is paired with a description or a prompt. The audio passes through the audio encoder to form a later representation of the audio. So all of these audios, let's say we have n audios here, and they will have n representations. The text goes to the text encoder, and similarly, we have a vector representation of the text description. And then we put these into a joint space, multimodal space, where then the objective here is that, okay, the true pairing of this audio, we know as like, we know what the true pairing of this audio is. And so in the latent space, the A1 representation should be closest to the T1 representation. And so A2 representation should be closest to the T2 representation. And I think here we use cosine similarity. So what we are saying is that these vectors should be closest to each other. Like A1 should be closer to T1 than it should be to T2. And so that's what our objective is to maximize this cosine similarity. For this task, once the model is trained, the model can be used in various inference modes, and we use it in the following two tasks: emotion audio retrieval and speech emotion recognition. The emotion audio retrieval task is set up like so. You can imagine retrieval is that you have a query. You ask the model, okay, give me a high intensity anger audio, or give me an audio where the male is expressing high intensity anger, or something like that. You can imagine querying it in whatever way. Once you have the query, it passes through the text encoder, and you have the vector representation. And in the data set, let's say you have n audios and you have n vector representations here. The model will output either the top one output, or like top n out, top k output, by ranking it. And so basically our idea here is the output of the model, the output audio of the model, is that really what the user asked for? Is that really high intensity anger? So that's how we measure the effectiveness of the trained model. And you can imagine speaker emotion recognition, speech emotion recognition is just the opposite of this task, where you're given the audio, testing audio, and you have the audio encoder, you encode it in a vector representation, and you have n classes for emotion that you want to classify this audio into. So you have anger, happy, sad. You pass through these labels to the text encoder. You have some text, or you have a vector representation of these. And then you say, okay, the output class of this audio will be the one that has the highest similarity with this audio recording. Okay, so these are the two setups that we look into, and these are the results for the emotion audio retrieval task. Basically, on the x-axis, you have precision numbers. So precision at 1 means that, okay, I have a query, and the model, I will just look at the top one output, the topmost output of the model. Is that really what I asked the model to output? Does that match the query? A P at 5 is we look at the top 5 and we see, okay, how many of those top 5 outputs match what I asked the model to do? And similarly, P at 10 is we look at top 10 outputs. So what you see here is 3 different colors, 3 different bars, which are like 3 different models that we are comparing. The first blue bar is captioned 4D, which is basically we take the clap model from the audio captioning, audio classification task. We do not do anything with it. We just use this as is. So that's our baseline. We do not include, fine tune, or include our prompting methodology. The orange bar is where we say, okay, we have the audio captioning data sets already in it. We fine tune it on top with 5 emotion data sets. But here we say, okay, let's not do any of the prompting methodology. We just use the class label of the emotion. We say, okay, this is an audio of anger, or this is person expressing anger, or this is happy, sad. We do not do any of the prompting methodology that I spoke about. The green model is where we say, okay, let's also pair it with, let's do the prompt augmentation. Let's extract the acoustic properties, and let's give more signal to the model in order to learn more of these correlations that we spoke about. And what we see here is that the green bar is where we are seeing some improvement in the model performance. And it is able to, when the query is give me anger audio, or give me happy audio, or give me sad audio, without even expressing what sort of acoustic property we want with it. We do not query give me high intensity anger audio. We just say give me anger audio. The green bar is able to perform much better. It has learned more correlation based on the way that we have prompted it. So that is an encouraging result. Similarly, for speech emotion recognition, what you see here is So RAVDES data set is one of the emotion data sets that I showed earlier that we use, but these are zero shot numbers, which means that we train our model on all of the other data sets that we have. We fine tune our model on all of the other emotion data sets we have, but we do not touch RAVDES data set. We keep it as outside. And then during testing, we test our models on samples from the RAVDES data set. And so what we are seeing here is that these are, so this is speech emotion recognition. We are just predicting the accuracy of how well the model has learned to predict the emotion. So random performance is what is given the distribution of the labels, how well are you to do if you were to randomly select any label. 4D is the same as what I said earlier, which is you take the CLAB model as is, you do not fine tune it or anything. And so this is the accuracy that we are getting on it. The green label, the green bar here is you take the CLAP model and you train it just on the emotion data sets from scratch. 4D, the yellow bar here, 4D plus 5ED is where you fine tune it on the emotion data sets with just the class label. And the blue bar here is you do the prompt augmentation in the way that I spoke about. So the sad part here is that with the prompt augmentation, we see some regression in the performance. We see that the performance decreases when we include the prompting methodology, as I spoke earlier, right? But this is zero shot, and this is pointing to one of the biggest problems in emotion domain, which is that since this is zero shot, since the model has not seen any samples from the RAVDES dataset, it is not able to generalize the correlations that it has learned from other datasets to the RAVDES dataset. And this is a problem that we see in emotion classification domain all the time, which is if you train a model on dataset X, it will not be able to do well on dataset Y. And so this ability to generalize out of domain is a pretty prevalent problem in this task, and that usually happens because the sort of people that are used while collecting the samples. Okay, they may be, if it's collected in a university, they may be more of younger age. If it's collected in the wild, it will be all sorts of age will be represented. Gender has a huge impact on this task. How are people expressing? How do males express their anger versus females express their anger? There's a lot of subjectivity in how how emotions are presented, and this shows up in the domain all the time. Okay, so this is zero shot, but let's say if we fine tune the model on some samples of the RAVDES dataset, then we see improvement from the prompting methodology. So what we say is that okay, we are out of domain, we are not seeing the improvement, but let's include some of the samples from RAVDES dataset into our training and then test it on the testing set of the RAVDES dataset. And there we see that using the prompting methodology, extracting the acoustic prompts and then pairing it with the audio, we are able to see improvements in the speech emotion recognition domain. So that is encouraging. But I just want to revisit our prompting methodology. One of the limitations of this is that we are, so remember I said that there are 4 acoustic properties we extract, but why just 4? There are so many other ways that we can describe the emotion. Our initial idea was, okay, we have these 4 properties that we know are correlated, and using these 4 properties, we can automate the process. But there are so many other ways that we can naturally describe the emotions. So let's go back to the basics. We are dealing with neural network models. Why not let the neural models discover ways of naturally describing these emotions that will be more beneficial to the task? So we go back to the drawing board and we see, okay, we are since we are creating the skeleton of the problem, it is sort of limiting what the model can learn. So how can we improve on that? To improve on this limitation, we introduce a SELM model, which we call the speech emotion language model. This model also takes in pairs of audio text pairs, as we saw in CLAP. They pass through similarly text encoder and audio encoder, and then some tokenizer that tokenizes the text and the speech tokens. And once we have these tokens, we add some these gray tokens in the textual space. And we say these gray tokens are what we call the prefix. And these tokens are the learnable parameters of the model. So if, for example, the prompt is high intensity anger or high male pitch anger or whatever, one of those 4 acoustic prompts. So these can be tokenized into the text tokens, but we will add these additional tokens that then the model will be able to learn on its own. So it can add whatever it wants on top of the prompt that we have. These tokens are then passed through our large language model, GPT in our case, which performs next token prediction and predicts the emotion of the output. So that's how the learnable parameters of this model are trained, is by the next token prediction objective. Once we have this model trained, we perform a speech emotion recognition, zero shot, few shot, and just like 4-way emotion recognition. And these are the results that we get. So what you're seeing here is we have the CLAP model, the CLAP 4D model, which is just trained on audio captioning dataset. So let's focus just on the RAVDES dataset that we have been seeing, the first column here. So CLAP gives us this performance 29.48. If we just do CLAP zero shot, which is the model that we train with prompt augmentation, we get this performance. But we see that when we do SELM zero shot, we see a huge improvement in the performance, which is that the model is, now when we give the ability to the model to learn on its own, to discover some features on its own, it is able to do better. And when we look at SELM 4 shot, which is 4 shot here means that we fine tune the model a little bit on some examples from RAVDES. And 4 shot means that we only use 4 examples of each emotion to fine tune the model. We see an improvement here, which is quite encouraging. And I think we see similar improvement in the other 2 data sets. In CREMA-D, this is another data set, and EMOCAP. So this is also pretty encouraging that with our, when we allow the model to learn on its own and to discover features on its own, it is able to perform slightly better. So this is a recap of the CLAP versus SELM performance on the RAVDES dataset. And these are the numbers that we have just seen, but just showing them again. On the x-axis, we have random, CLAP, SELM, and SELM 4-shot performance, and we see a steady improvement in the accuracy of the speech emotion recognition task. Okay, so this is one of the key ideas that we started with, is how can we improve our emotion labels? How can we expand our emotion labels from just the discrete representation and use natural language? We are in the world of large language models. So how can we use natural language in order to improve our emotion labels? Okay, so now I want to jump into the second part of the lecture here, which deals with what is personality decoding from the speech. But I want to give a disclaimer here. In this part of the talk, we will not be talking about speech, and I will go into why that is. We will be dealing with the with text, or with a textual representation of personality, and that is because we will talk about that. So what really is personality? Personality is a unique set of traits, behaviors, and patterns that define an individual's consistent way of interacting with the world. So you can imagine emotions are pretty short-lived. We express an emotion, we move on to another one or another one. But personality is consistent. For years, an individual will have the same personality. So it is a pretty different task than emotion recognition. It is very long-lived. It is consistent, but it is also pretty hard to get data for this domain, to collect data in that manner where a person consistently shows the same personality over longitudinal data. So, but just to go over, okay, so we represent, if you look at psychology, there are a number of ways that personality has been represented, but if you read some papers, the widely accepted theoretical construct of personality is the ocean traits, and this ocean trait will come up again and again in the papers. So what is ocean? Ocean is an acronym that stands for openness, C stands for conscientiousness, E stands for extroversion, and so on and so forth. So we have these 5 different dimensions in which we bucket people. We say whether a person is high on openness or high on consciousness, and so on and so forth. So these are the 5 different axes or dimensions of representing personality. So the task of automatically decoding personality can be set up like so. We have emotion and we have data sets that has speech samples. We pass it through some model and which outputs the ocean traits. However, there are 2 major problems with this framework. There is insufficient data. There's very few data sets in this domain, and the labels are extremely noisy, which are pretty big problems if you want to work with neural models, which are very data intensive tools. So what we do is we look at the problem and we try to approach it in innovative ways. We say, okay, we have these ocean traits, but what really are ocean traits? We have some data sets where the ocean traits have been labeled, but how meaningful are these ocean labels? They're very noisy. But in this world of the neural networks, can we come up with better representations of personality? Can we look back at how were the ocean traits discovered, and can we make use of newer tools to rediscover them or to reinvent them? So we go back to how were the ocean traits discovered. And this research in psychology started from like as early as 1930s, where people sat down. So this was the initial work done by these 2 authors, Alpert and Odbert. And these guys sat down and looked at an English dictionary and noted down all of the different words that they thought were used to describe other human beings. And they noted down 18,000 different words, so like adjectives, that they thought were used to describe other people. And then following authors that came, researchers that came, looked at that list and they did factor analysis and they identified different bases in these list of words that they thought, okay, we have these words, but what are the general clusters that we can see that are best used to describe other people. So people said, okay, researchers discovered these are the 16 different unique ways that we use to discover other people, or these are the 5 different ways that so these 5 bases were discovered as early on as like 1950s. But all of these subsequent works have been based on the 18,000 words that were initially discovered in the 1930s. So given this is the setting that we are working on, there are so many if you just look at large language models or like the textual part of this, you can imagine, you can let your imagination run wild and think about all of the different ways in today's world that you can now reanalyze these list of words to rediscover the bases using the data intensive tools that we have. So people discovered 16, people discovered 5, 3, 2 different essential bases or dimensions which are used to describe other people. But 5 was is the most accepted, widely used one. I think I am a little bit on time, but I will quickly go over the approach. So what we do is that we try to reanalyze these words. We start with the 75 words identified by Norman. Norman is this person who happens here, who reduces this list of 18,000 words to 75 words and discovers the 5 bases. So we start with the list of 75 words that Norman has. And if you look at what these words are like talkativeness or silence or self-pity or warmth. What we say is, okay, these are just words, but how are these words used to describe other people? We look at Project Gutenberg dataset, which is an open source dataset, and I encourage you to look into it. It's a collection of ebooks. And so what we say is, it's a really good collection of many different books. And so what we say is that we have these words, but we want to pick sentences where these words are being used to describe other people. So for example, one of the sentences that includes talkativeness is, during lunch, both girls were struck by his unusual talkativeness. So this word is being used to describe a guy's behavior in some way, right? And so what we do is for each word, we collect a bunch of sentences and we extract context embeddings of these sentences using language models like BERT, Llama, OPT, and T5. And then we cluster these embeddings using neural networks and k-means. And we say, okay, instead of us sitting down and doing and studying how these words are being used to describe other people, doing intensive labeling processes that the other authors have went through, why not make use of the language models that we have at our hands right now? So this is sort of what we do arithmetically, but I will just go over this in a rush, but you can read the paper. For each word, we have multiple sentences, and each sentence has an embedding. These embeddings are assigned to the nearest cluster based on the cluster centers, minimizing the distance. We track which cluster each embedding belongs to for a single word across all its sentences, forming a cluster membership list. And then for this membership list, we compute the probability distribution over clusters, representing the likelihood of the word belonging to that cluster. And then finally, for a given cluster size n, you can imagine we set the size to 2 or 3 or 5, and we say, what is the cluster entropy of the cluster when the cluster size is set to 5? And we study this entropy basically to discover, okay, what is the best cluster size in our case. And these are the results that we get. On the x-axis, you see the different number of clusters we set at cluster size 2, and on the y-axis, you have cluster entropy. And what we see here is that the different colors represent what, when we use a different large language model. Bolded line is the mean of the cluster entropy, and the shaded area is the standard deviation. And what we find on average is that the cluster entropy is lowest when the cluster size is 2, second lowest when it is 4, then 5, and so on. This is an interesting finding, since what this tells us is that the best way of clustering people is when clustered into 2 groups, then when clustered into 4 groups, and so on and so forth. But is that really like the difference between 2 and 4 and 5? Is that like statistically significantly different or meaningful for our task? That's a good question to delve into deeper. But what we do is that we look at the representative word for each cluster. A representative word is the word that occurs most frequently in a cluster. And the interesting thing here is that when we look at the BERT clustering, the clustering when we use BERT embeddings, and when the cluster size is set to 2, so C here is cluster size, it is set to 2 on BERT. We see that the representative word comes from the extroversion domain. So both silence and talkativeness are extroverted trait, like they come from that dimension. When we use Llama embeddings, we discovered that they also come from extroversion. OPT hones on the conscientiousness scale, and T5 on the neuroticism scale. So that's pretty interesting. And when we set the cluster size to 5, what we see here is that with BERT, these are the 5 representative words, and all of them come from one of the ocean traits. And we see this that either the clusters are either honing on one of the bases out of the 5 ocean, or they're choosing one representative word from each one of the 5 bases from the ocean. Llama also does the same. OPT and T5 are slightly different because the representative word occurs multiple times, so that you see less highlights there. But and Llama, sorry, T5 picks on just the extroversion trait, but this is a pretty interesting finding for BERT and for Llama. So are we proposing new bases for personality different from the widely used 5? Our findings suggest that there is no unique cluster size that is optimal for clustering people into personality traits. We observe that there is not a significant difference, and this suggests that ocean bases, but what this suggests is that the ocean bases are not the only way of clustering people, and other numbers may be equally informative. And as we have seen in other tasks with how the emotion recognition or speech processing domain has adapted, and how we did the emotion classification from CLAP to SELM, we let the deep learning model discover it. We'll let the deep learning model discover the optimal number of clusters given the task at hand and the downstream task, the downstream use cases. So this is a conclusion from this part of the talk. Circling back, we studied different ways of better labeling the emotional personality so that we can make better computational decoding models. Um, I want to leave with some future directions that you can explore for your projects, or if you're interested in taking this up as research topics. There are three different directions that I want to emphasize here. One is seamless communication between humans and humans and machines using emotion and personality decoding encoding models. And this is always going back to, okay, how can we better the emotion and personality recognition tasks? There's always, these tasks are still behind on what the SOTA is on, let's say, speaker recognition or speech detection. So these tasks are still behind because of how subjective they are. That leads me into the second task here, which is adapting psychological models to different cultures, languages, ages, and genders. These tasks are very, very subjective tasks. Based on how the way that I express my anger is different from today and tomorrow. It's going to be different from you, all of you guys. And so these are pretty subjective tasks. The way an American expresses their anger versus, let's say, South Asian expresses their anger is pretty different. So, and that shows up in the data sets. And so making generalizable models is a pretty challenging task in this, and it's an open challenge in this task. The third is something that I went over, revisiting the categorization of psychological traits. These tasks, emotion and personality, are like what have been studied in psychology for years. But now in computer science domain, we are taking the definition of what emotion and personality is from psychology. We are adapting their definitions, but we need to adapt them in a way that is useful for computer science models, for our data intensive models. And this was a key idea that I discovered that I explored in my research, and I encourage you to take it up and to look into it more. So that was the majority of my talk. I just want to go over a little bit about my work at Apple, and I can give very little information here. But what I can talk about is that I work on the Siri voice trigger model stack, which basically is when you say, "Hey Siri," and your device wakes up and starts listening to you. It is a bunch of different models that are working on device. So these are on-device models that detect the trigger phrase. Uh, and the most important thing is that these models need to be small, they need to be high performing, they need to have very little impact on the power, and very little latency. So you can imagine that having a large language model on device having these properties is going to be really difficult. So we work with small models that are highly optimized for on-device behavior, but also high performing. Unfortunately, I cannot go into much more detail about what the architecture is, or what are the different sort of settings for the models. But you can imagine that we are using deep neural models. What I can say is that when we detect the trigger phrase, this is open source knowledge, so I'm not exposing anything. But this is one model that detects the trigger phrase all the time whenever it is listening, and it lights up when you say, "Hey Siri." And then there are a bunch of other models that are slightly bigger. Okay, one model is pretty small that is always listening, but then the other models that are following can be a little bit bigger, can have higher performance than the first model that occurred in that stack. So that's pretty much what I can tell you. I want to go over a little bit to inspire you guys if you want to take up the PhD path. I started working in this lab. These are all of my advisors and my fellow PhD survivors. And unfortunately, when this picture was taken, I was not present, so I edited myself in on the corner. But if there's some advice I can give you is, and if you want to take up research, get involved in research projects, read up-to-date research topics, read blog, Reddit, expos, and make yourself available to doing the grunt, dirty work of, let's say, data cleaning or data collection. And sometimes it is the grunt work that is the starting point of something bigger. And so the last bit of wisdom here is my advisor said this to me in very early on in my PhD journey, which was that don't be afraid to attend talks where you understand nothing. And I was attending talks where I didn't understand anything. And he said that don't be afraid to do that because something might stick, a word might stick, and that is worth it. You might hear that word again 2 years from now, and you might remember something from that talk. And even if it's a sentence, that is worth it. So do go attend talks, read papers that you understand very little about, but read them again and again and again. This is my contact information. You can contact me here. This is my Google Scholar page. You can look me up. So that's my talk. Thank you, and open to questions. There is one question in the chat about data sets. The datasets now are open or closed. Can you share with us? The datasets are open source. You can find them online. Just look up. So for example, RavDes, you can just look it up. You'll be able to find it online. Yeah.
So if you have any other questions, let's see if we have any questions here. Do we have any questions in the chat? Maybe you can raise your hand, or maybe you can write your question in the chat. In the meanwhile, I have one question. So in the CLAP contrastive audio language pre-training, you mentioned that the dataset you were using were quite small, right? So I just have a question about the efficiency of the audio language pre-training, because if you're starting your pre-training from scratch, you require samples in the order of millions at the very least.
Yeah.
So what's the efficiency when you already have a pre-trained text encoder and a pre-trained audio encoder, and you're just trying to sort of learn the emotion side, right, rather than learning everything from scratch? So what's the data efficiency in that?
Yeah, so what we try to do here is that most of the, let me go back to the CLAP architecture. We freeze parts of the model that are really big, that have millions of parameters. So we do not we freeze the text encoder and the audio encoder here. And they are followed by some linear layers that those parts of the model are fine-tuned on top of the CLAP model on the emotion data sets. So to be able to say, okay, we have this huge model that was trained on thousands of hours of audio captioning data set, but let's fine tune it on a couple of hours of emotion data set that is pretty, that will change all of the parameters of the model, and it's going to be really hard to bring it to a good optimal point. So what we do is we freeze the encode, we freeze parts of the larger parts of the model, like the text and the audio encoder, and we only train few parts of the layers, like the linear layers that are followed by the encoders. So that is sort of like us limiting the number of parameters that we fine tune on the emotion datasets. And you see this methodology occurring in all over the place when you have less number of data that you have at your hand and you want to fine tune. Similarly, in SELM model, that's also what we do. We freeze parts of the text encoder and the audio encoder, and we only fine tune parts of the model, the smaller parts of the model, few layers of the model on the emotion data set.
Great, thank you. So I'll now open to the people in the chat. So I think we have a question from Kevin. So Kevin, if you could turn on your mic and ask your question. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for the great presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
yes.
We can hear you.
Yep, perfect. Yeah, so again, thank you very much. And I just wanted to know if you're about the data your model was trained on. So are you aware, or do you know of any if your model was trained on any like atypical speech patterns, like I'm talking about people with like say like learning disabilities or people from different dialects who may have different like speech patterns. Do you know if your model is trained on any of these?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I was saying, as I was saying, in emotion data sets, that's a big problem that you have where you have little representation. You can imagine like these big data sets are collected at US universities where
Okay.
the population is young college going students. So that is the population group that is highly represented in the data sets. And if we take these models and we go to South Asia or East Asia and we say, will these models be able to perform better? And I have done in one of my like we took the models that I trained in the wild, and there was this conference, and we discovered that it wasn't doing very well, and that is a problem that we see, like dialectical differences, and all of these things show up in the task, and these models have a difficulty generalizing. In order of speaking disability, I don't think that they have a lot of representation of that either.
No, no, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a problem that we have. Data collection is pretty expensive, and that's why I think a lot of the SOTA now is looking into these models that I spoke about, like Hubert and Wave 2 Vec 2, which are trained on unlabeled speech data. How can we? And they might be trained on on speech with of people with disabilities, or speech represented from all over the world with different dialects and different languages. So that is people are now using those models for the tasks, which makes sense. But yeah.
With learning disabilities, because I've put a great deal of thought into this problem of like speech detection of people with learning disabilities or atypical speech patterns. And I know of people with learning disabilities, they do a lot of like pointing at things because like people can't understand what they're saying, so they point and use their hands a lot. So, what do you think of like multimodal speech recognition? Have you experimented with that at all?
I have for emotion recognition. Most of my works were multimodal. So instead of just using the speech signal, we also looked at the transcript.
Yes.
But I imagine like what you're saying is instead of just using the transcript, also look at facial expressions, for example, or look
Yes.
at hand gestures.
Yes.
So with I think that will be very informative if you're looking at people with disabilities, because like that's what you're saying, right? They use a lot of their hands and pointing at things. But from my experience of just using speech and transcript, so these multimodal models actually perform much better than just using the speech signal. And that's because, okay, if you're just using the speech signal, you can capture, okay, the person is angry because they're speaking loudly.
Yeah.
But the transcript tells you a lot more information. The transcript says, okay,
Mhm.
the person is really saying something angry. And I imagine if you use like facial expressions or hand gestures, you'll get similar information. So the idea is that I think it'll improve.
Okay. Thank
Great.
you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So we'll take one more question from Musarrat, and then we'll close the talk. So Musarrat, if you could turn on your mic and ask your question, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the nice talk. Actually, I have one question. So in the first part, you mentioned that you use 5 acoustic feature identified by human being for the model. Then later you automate this, let the model learn it through the token embeddings. And have you explored what the model learned in terms of acoustic feature, or are there any relationship between human identified 5 acoustic feature and the learned features?
Yeah, that's a good question. So basically, the question is that if we if we look at the prefix and the text tokens go back to the prompt that we are adding, right? High intensity anger. But what is the prefix here? do they cleanly map to some English words or some acoustic, like English words that point to something meaningful? And the answer is no. So we look at the prefix tokens here, and they are gibberish, basically. But you can imagine that you're letting the model discover them, and the model is able to find some patterns that maybe are like not from the English language, but it is able to learn different things. So the answer is that it does not cleanly map to something. Oh, this is an acoustic property that the model is honing up to, and this so cleanly maps to the speech domain and the emotion domain. But that is not the case. And I think whenever we look at like there was this one task of large language model discovery, this is looking at what the model is learning, just going back from the embeddings to the token space. I think that mapping is always very messy. You can't really map to proper English words there. That's a good question.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Musarrat. And so we'll end the talk here. If you have any questions,